During a race riot, 40 to 50 Chinese mine workers were slaughtered by their white co-workers in Rock Springs, Wyoming in 1885. The violence was described as feral, and the victims were scalped, branded, mutilated, dismembered, decapitated, and lynched, and then their homes were burned to the ground, with a total of 79 structures being lost. The Chinese survivors fled into the hills to the nearby town of Evanston, Wyoming, and could not return to Rock Springs for over a week until U.S. Army troops were dispatched to escort the miners back to work. This letter from Rock Springs, dated in 1893, a full 8 years later, mentions specifically that massacre in 1885, and also the fact that 8 years on, there were still armed guards at the mines in order to ensure there was no further violence against these Chinese miners. This writer also mentions that the Celestial portion of town, as Chinese miners were then called, was the only clean place there was in the otherwise filthy town of Rock Springs, Wyoming. This was very common from the very beginning of Chinese labor because the Old West was a notoriously disgusting place to live. This lack of any attempt to integrate with the rest of society was often cited in anti-Chinese rhetoric as one of the reasons that the Chinese were undesirable, and it had been often repeated ever since the Chinese built the vast majority of the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad known as the Central Pacific. White workers often complained that the Chinese drove down labor prices, and conflicts and racism were endemic across the West until in 1882, Congress passed a bill actually putting a moratorium on Chinese immigration for 10 years from that point in time. This nationwide anti-Chinese sentiment influenced the miners at Rock Springs, and one day before the riot, 2 Chinese workers were beaten to death at the mines because they were supposedly in the wrong room of the mine that the white workers believed was reserved exclusively for them. The next day, these white miners armed themselves and entered the Chinese encampment from 2 different directions in a pincher move in order to capture all of the Chinese laborers. At this point, the slaughter and atrocities ensued, and it's reported that the wives of the miners actually stood on a bridge overlooking that Chinese camp and cheered their husbands on while the violence occurred. 16 men were arrested in the aftermath, but both the local judge and the local DA refused to bring charges against those white miners. They were released from the courthouse that very same day to cheering crowds of Rock Springs citizens. When the Chinese legation in Washington took up the matter with the federal government, they were told that the U.S. government would reimburse them for the loss of property to the tune of $147,000, but they were to be given nothing for the actual victims of the slaughter. The Secretary of State, Bayard, specifically told the Chinese legation that the reason for the violence was because the Chinese refused to assimilate into the society in which they were working. And as a result, the violence was caused by the actions of the Chinese workers who were the victims. Today, the site has been completely incorporated into the growing town of Rock Springs, and a public elementary school sits directly in the middle of where the Chinese camp was. Thankfully, we have pieces of history like this to remind us of what happened.